So, welcome to those that are joining us online, either live on stream or later in the week. We are today looking at John 6, which is the next chapter in our series of looking at John. Obviously, last week we looked at John 5. Actually, it wasn't last week, it was 2 weeks ago. We looked at John 5. We've moved on to John 6 today. And as with all the other chapters in John that we've been looking at, there is a lot in John chapter 6. There's actually 71 verses. So inevitably, we're just picking out bits of these chapters where we're hoping that God is speaking to us in specifics. And in John chapter 6, we see a radical shift from the previous one-to-one miracles that Jesus has done, the interactions Jesus had, for example, with the woman at the well, and with individual healings like the person at the pool that we heard about a couple of weeks ago. And there's also mentioned in verse 2 of the John 6, 1 to 14, there's noticeable other miracles where God has been healing people. But as I say, in this chapter, John 6, it's almost as if Jesus moves from those one-to-one interactions to where he upturns the natural world. He's on a much bigger scale, as we've seen from the reading that Ali did. I should have said, by the way, that I'm not going to read out the verses, but Susan's just putting them through slowly just so you can see them, because we heard the story. I just want you to see the scriptures, but just look at those as I'm talking. So in John 6, things develop at breakneck speed in a very short time, probably only over a couple of days. And in John 6, I could have looked at Jesus walking on water or discussing with the religious leaders, i.e. arguing about theology, or the discourse between Jesus and the crowds, where he uses the feeding that we're going to be looking at in a minute as an analogy for his real purpose, bringing the kingdom of God, not just feeding physically, but feeding spiritually. And I didn't do the bread of life because, if you remember, we looked at that a couple of months ago, so you can get that online. Jesus says later on, I'm the bread of life. So we can look at that one there. But I wanted to look at the feeding of the 5,000 today, the bread and the fishes. Firstly, because it's a good story for an all-age service, but genuinely because I believe that there is a message for us as a church as we contemplate the next few months. And it also reminds us, as I said, that Jesus is the bread of life, our Saviour and our Redeemer, as we come later to communion. So we've got the verses up so you can look at them, and while you do so, let's think about the background. And if you're online, you might like to obviously look on the Bible or on a phone. This story is probably the best known story in the Bible. It's in all four Gospels, as Andy alluded to in his prayer. It's also in Matthew 14, Mark 6 and Luke 9. It grabs the imagination, and yet it touches us where we are, because I think we could all imagine going to a meeting that goes on and on and on, and suddenly we get hungry. And many of us might have been in church services where the dinner's been in the oven at home, and we know we want to get home. So it touches us in a very real way that we can identify with the crowd. And it's so familiar that we take it for granted. We can just read it, and move on to the next bit of the chapter. But as the children's story that Ali read said, the basic message is that when Jesus takes little things, they become big and powerful and amazing. Now, we all know the story, so I don't need to labour it, but just a bit of background. Jesus has, and we're told in other Gospels, Jesus has just heard that Herod, his cousin, and his fellow prophet has been killed. And this has a huge impact on Jesus, because Jesus realises that things are moving ahead. And we're told that the disciples and Jesus move away from where they've been preaching, just to get away from the crowds who are following him because of all the healings he's been doing. So they move across the Lake of Galilee to Bethsaida on the other side. But the crowds track him down and follow to continue to hear his teaching. And I just wonder what Jesus felt as he saw these crowds coming over the horizon, having just escaped. We all sometimes just need to get away, don't we? But life then intervenes, and we've got to do something. And the people stay, not just because of the miracles they've seen, but also because of the teaching and the power they hear in Jesus' words. But as evening falls, we're told, compassion reigns, and Jesus decides it's time to stop for tea and feed this massive crowd that's with him. Now the task, and therefore the opportunity, was huge. We're told there's 5,000 men there, so even if there wasn't a woman or a child for every man, there's at least sort of 7,000 or 8,000 people there probably. And plus, Jesus, apart from wanting to feed them physically, knew that he wanted to show them more than just that physical feeding. He wanted to be able to tell them that bread and fish are for here today and gone tomorrow. But if you come to me, he says in verse 35, I am the bread of life. You will never need to hunger spiritually again. So it wasn't just the physical part. He wanted to make this something that would leave an impression on them. So if I wanted to summarise the story today, I think my takeaway words are big vision, small actions. And Andy alluded to this in the prayer. We'll just unpack this in a minute. But God has a big vision. Hopefully we've got a big vision of what God can do. But sometimes we need to make small actions to make that happen. The opportunity and the challenge was great. The resources appeared extremely limited. But when offered to Jesus, they were transformed into something amazing. 5,000 people fed, and we're told loads left over. It wasn't just a scrimp, just eat what you can and there's not enough left. There was 12 baskets left over, just because somebody was prepared to give up their snack. So to see how this might impact us, I just wanted to quickly look at 3 people involved in the story. The first is Philip. Jesus says to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? We're told that Jesus asked him this to test him, which actually strikes me as a bit odd and worries me a bit. Jesus actually knew that Philip didn't have the answer, but Philip is asked the question anyway. Why did he pick on Philip? Well, we're told that they were near the town of Bethsaida, and in John 1 we're told that Philip came from Bethsaida, as did Peter and Andrew. So perhaps Philip wasn't surprised that Jesus came to him to try and feed this lot. He was the local lad. He knew where the Costco was. He knew where the Lidl would be open at that time of night. He knew where you could get a good meal. Just out of interest, anyone know how many people live on Kingsbrook estate? Round figures. Any guesses? Okay. Well, so in 2021 census, there was 10,000 people on the estate. So it's obviously more than that now. That's the parish, the political parish. My point being that what Jesus was saying to Philip is, it's like me coming in here today and saying to Pauline and Sally, actually, next week when Phil and Anne are here, let's just not feed the church, let's feed the whole of Kingsbrook. And Pauline's going to say, well, I know some people, but how on earth are we going to afford that? That's the question that Jesus asks Philip. How are you going to do it? So, of course, when he's asked, Philip's brain goes into overdrive. Jesus is asking him, where the bakers are, where are the food stores. Philip saw the problem and he tried to solve it logically and with his brain. He tried to solve what he saw as a big vision, but with a big action, and he couldn't fulfill that big action. Let's find the supplies, he said. He didn't say, we can't find the bread. He says, we haven't got the money. So he immediately jumped ahead and thought, okay, we might be able to get people to give us the bread and stuff, but how are we going to pay for it? And Philip comes back and says, if we had a year's wages, we could only just do something with them. Now, I had to cater for an event of 100 people a couple of weeks ago, and you can't cater for less than £5 a head. So to do 10,000 people, 7,000 people, you're talking 30, 40, 50,000 pounds. And so Philip's right. A year's wage will hardly touch the problem. This is not just going to happen, Jesus. How are we going to pay to feed everyone? The thing was, as Terry sort of suggested, Philip was looking for solutions. He was overwhelmed with the request, but he wasn't looking to the creator of life. He knew the story how God had fed the Israelites in the Old Testament. I mean, God had fed the whole nation for 30, 40 years. So Philip knew the history of the Bible. He'd seen Jesus do miracles, but instead of that, Philip immediately tries to sort it out himself. So when we're challenged by life, by circumstances, or calling to do something for God, where do we turn to? Do we start planning and trying to solve it? Do we work out the logistics? Or do we actually back off because it's too much for us to do? Or do we turn to our Creator, Jesus, to help and for reassurance? I have a lot of sympathies for Philip, because that's my first mode, going to fixing it rather than turning to Jesus. Second person is, of course, the boy. We all sympathise with this little lad, don't we? We know very little about him. We don't even know his name. Clearly, he must have been under 13, so he's quite small. And Andrew and Peter, who are also from Bethsaida, come to Jesus and say, we scoured the crowd and we found this little lad and he's got this, a little basket of fish and bread. One question that's been alluded to by some commentators is, where were his mum and dad? Why was he out on his own at that time of night? And more importantly, how come he still had some food left that late in the evening? If any of you have ever had teenagers, you know that food does not last long in the hands of a teenager. So it's been suggested, and it's only a sort of hypothesis, that perhaps it wasn't his lunch. Perhaps he'd actually come out to sell this stuff to the crowd. He was trying to make a bit of money for his family. And if that was the case, it doesn't really matter whether it was or not, but if that was the case, does that make his sacrifice more or less? Actually giving up not just his lunch, but possibly some income for the family. I wonder what he felt when the disciples suggested that he gave this to Jesus. Was it a sense of loss, a sense of sacrifice? Perhaps that it was a pointless exercise. This is not going to go far. It'd be far better if I had it or if I just shared it with one other person. It'd be better if everybody had. If a few people had something, than everybody just had a crumb. I'm sure it wasn't easy, because for all of us, it's much better to it's much easier for us to hang on to what we have than to give it away, isn't it? And I've felt like that. It's not just a case of not wanting to give it, but it's a case of what difference can it make? My contribution, my skills, my resources are too small. It's better that I hang on to it, because then I might be able to do something with it rather than give it away. I can't share it. And yet, despite his feelings, he hands over what he has to Jesus. And the result was beyond his wildest dreams, and we're still talking about it today. And that's because Jesus, the next person, takes the tiny offering and makes it into something big. Jesus asks the people to sit, and we're told that they were able to sit because there was grass there. So I assume this is unusual, not everywhere had grass. And isn't that detail amazing? Every time I wonder whether the Bible's true, it's those little details that make the difference. It was a real place at a real time. We're told it was just before Passover. We're told it's a real place where there was grass, and it's the equivalent of me saying, let's meet up in Wendover Woods. Oh yeah, where the barbecues are. And any of you who've been there will know exactly where I mean. And when this story would have been told after the event, the people listening would have said, oh yeah, I know that bit near Bethsaida where it's green and grassy. That's where they all sat. Because Jesus wanted them to sit and to be comfortable. It wasn't a grab-all-you-can buffet and walk away. It was a sit-down meal, communing together, and it was something special, a special, memorable event. He knew what he was going to do, and he wanted them to see and to remember it. So he takes the loaves and the fishes, and he multiplies the impact so that all are fed and blessed. And there is a surplus. It occurred to me, it's great to have 12 baskets of bread. I'm glad there wasn't any fish left overnight. So Jesus was very compassionate in that sense. We didn't have any rotting fish. So 12 baskets of bread. It was a sort of lavish event. So they knew that they'd been fed and that God was lavishing his blessing upon them. But the real message was not the full tum, as that picture showed, but it was a remembrance of God's provision to the Israelites and God's provision to them. And this isn't lost in the crowd, because later on in the chapter, which we haven't read, but you can look at it later, in verse 31, they refer back to God's blessing of their ancestors in the desert, and says to Jesus, what sign will you give us? And because our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. And Jesus sort of says, I've just fed you. Isn't that enough? Do you not see what I'm doing here? So Jesus took what he had and blessed the people and used it as an illustration of of Jesus, the bread of life. So what does it say to us today? The challenge, I believe, God is offering us is, what is your vision? And that may be, as Terry said, coming out of uncertainty, or it may be something we've got a real longing for or a heart for, or it may be a challenge that we're facing. Where do we want God's kingdom to come to us as individuals and as a church through his Spirit? Do we have a longing for Kingsbrook? Do we still have a longing for Broughton, where there's many years invested? Do we need some impossible relationships to be restored or blessed? Are we facing challenges at work or school? Or what about what we see on the news? Does it strike our heart and something says to us, we've got to do something about this, even if it's just prayer? Perhaps our response is like Philip's, I just can't do this. We're in good company. Philip, Andrew and Peter said the same. Or do we say, what little I can do and what I have, I hand over to you, Jesus, and look for you to do something with it? because he knows what he's going to do. So I encourage us to think what our vision is, where we're hungry or thirsting, where do we seek Jesus to intervene, and what response can we give. Now, this is not a shopping list. I've just thought of some things we might want to consider, but God is speaking to us all in different ways. But it may just be to do with money. We might want to give up a coffee a week for a month. People like Médecins Sans Frontières and Tear Fund can do a lot with £10. We may just want to make some practical response like that. It may be to do with time. We may just need to do a little phone call or an email or meet with somebody. Here's something for those of us that don't live on Kingsbrook. We might want to come and have a wander around the estate. Do we all know where the secondary school is? Or the community centre? So we might just want to, instead of going up to the woods one day, come and have a wander around the estate and just pray for this estate which we're privileged to meet on every week and where we've hopefully got a vision for. Or praying, we're all too busy, but perhaps we could just find either 15 minutes a day or an extra 15 minutes a day to come into God's presence. Or, and I have to say, it could be involvement at church or at more. This is not a shopping list, as I say. It's just, what is God saying to us? What are the things that God's been prompting us? And we're saying, actually, I can't do that because it's, I just haven't got the resources. We need to recognise that the solution is not in our hands. It's not doing those things that make the difference. It's the offering that makes the difference. And if you're already doing these things, then please carry on with the small actions and share them when we come together as we see Jesus multiply them and fulfilling his big vision. Jesus presents us with the big visions. All we need to do is to offer the small actions. The results may seem small individually, but when God is at work, people begin to start to talk about it and wonder what's going on. Just that, in the fact that you've been caring for somebody, then they tell somebody else, and God's kingdom multiplies in that way. And then people recognise that it's not what we do, just like the crowd recognised it was not the boy of the disciples, but it's Jesus and God at work in our community. So just the finishing thought is, what are our loaves and fishes, and what can Jesus do with them? So for those in the stream, we're going to stop now and just look at a video which we can't share, but I'll send a link out through Al during the week, so you can look at that. Thanks for joining us, and bless you for the rest of the day.